On the 15th of August 1944, beneath the scorching North African sun near the town of Kasserine, Corporal James Daniel Dawson from Pike County, Kentucky, stood beside a Sherman tank with grease-stained hands and a mason jar filled with amber liquid that smelled like his grandfather's backwoods still. The other mechanics in the 2nd Armored Division laughed, calling him everything from crazy to dangerous, convinced his hillbilly tinkering would blow up the entire motor pool. They had no idea they were watching the birth of a modification that would fundamentally change how American armor moved across European battlefields for the remainder of the conflict. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What those skeptical mechanics couldn't foresee was that within 8 weeks, Jimmy Dawson's desperation solution, born from Appalachian moonshine knowledge, would not only make Sherman tanks faster than their German counterparts, but would also solve a critical reliability problem that had plagued American armor since the North African campaign began. The transformation from ridicule to widespread adoption would become one of the war's most unusual tales of battlefield innovation. Jimmy Dawson had grown up in the hollows of eastern Kentucky, where his family had been distilling corn whiskey since before the American Civil War. His education came not from textbooks, but from watching his grandfather manipulate temperatures, adjust mixtures, and understand the chemistry of combustion in ways that no formal training could teach. When the draft notice arrived in 1942, Jimmy was 23 years old, thin as a rail post, with calloused hands and an intuitive understanding of how liquids burned and engines ran. The Army recognized his mechanical aptitude immediately. After basic training at Fort Knox, they assigned him to the motor pool, where he maintained the very tanks his grandfather had seen only in newsreels at the county seat theater. The Sherman medium tank, officially designated the M4, was the backbone of American armored forces. Weighing 33 tons and powered by a Continental radial aircraft engine producing 400 horsepower, it was reliable, easily produced, and adequately armed. But it had one critical weakness that every tanker knew and feared. Lieutenant Marcus Reynolds, a tank commander from Philadelphia who had graduated from Penn State with an engineering degree, explained the problem to Jimmy during a sweltering afternoon in July. The Sherman, for all its virtues, was slower than the German Panzer Mark V, which the troops called the Panther. While American intelligence reports indicated the Panther could reach 28 miles per hour on roads, the Sherman typically managed 24 at best. In desert conditions with dust clogging air filters and heat straining every component, that gap widened. More critically, Reynolds explained, the Sherman's engine ran hot. The Continental radial was an air-cooled design adapted from aircraft use, and in the North African heat, cooling became a constant battle. Tanks returned from operations with overheated engines, warped cylinder heads, and damaged gaskets. The official solution involved modified air intakes and cooling fins, but these only partially addressed the problem. Jimmy listened, nodded, and said nothing. But that night, lying in his tent while sand whispered against the canvas, he thought about his grandfather's still. He remembered watching the old man add specific compounds to the mash, adjusting not just the alcohol content, but the burn characteristics. His grandfather could make a fuel that burned cooler and cleaner by understanding ratios that chemists in laboratories might spend months calculating. The Sherman ran on 80-octane gasoline, standard military fuel produced in vast quantities, and shipped across the Atlantic in tankers that dodged German submarines. Jimmy understood that he couldn't change the base fuel. The logistics of the war effort made that impossible, but he could modify it at the point of use, adding compounds that would alter combustion characteristics. His first experiments began in secret, using spare fuel and borrowed equipment from the motor pool. He knew from moonshine production that alcohol burned cooler than gasoline. He also knew that certain additives could increase octane ratings, allowing fuel to burn more efficiently without pre-detonation or knocking. His grandfather had used lead compounds, but Jimmy knew those were already in military fuel. What he needed was something that would work synergistically with existing additives, improving both cooling and power output. He started with ethanol, which the Army used for medical purposes. By mixing precise ratios of ethanol with standard gasoline and adding small amounts of acetone, which the motor pool used for cleaning, he created a blend that theory suggested might burn 10 to 15 degrees cooler while actually increasing combustion efficiency. The acetone would help the fuel atomize better in the carburetor, while the ethanol would lower peak combustion temperatures. The mockery began when Sergeant Robert O'Brien from Boston caught Jimmy pouring his mixture into a test barrel. O'Brien, a career mechanic who had maintained trucks since before the war, took one look at the mason jar and the careful measurements and laughed so hard he had to lean against a half-track for support. Within an hour, the entire motor pool knew that the hillbilly from Kentucky was making moonshine for tanks. The jokes were endless. Someone painted a miniature still on the side of Jimmy's toolbox. Another mechanic started calling him Moonshine Dawson, and the nickname stuck. Even Lieutenant Reynolds, normally supportive, expressed concern about unauthorized fuel modifications. The risk of engine damage, he explained, was too high. Every Sherman was needed, and they couldn't afford to lose vehicles to experimental tinkering. But Jimmy persisted, testing his mixture in a small generator during evening hours when no one paid attention. The results fascinated him. The engine ran noticeably cooler, the exhaust smelled different, and the generator seemed to produce steadier power. He adjusted his ratios, documenting everything in a worn notebook with precise measurements written in the careful script his mother had taught him. Technical Sergeant William Harrison, the motor pool's senior non-commissioned officer, was a different breed from the mockers. Harrison had grown up on a farm in Iowa, and he recognized genuine innovation when he saw it, even if it came wrapped in Appalachian drawl and presented in mason jars. When Jimmy finally gathered the courage to present his findings, Harrison listened. The data was compelling. Jimmy had recorded temperature differentials, noting that his mixture reduced engine operating temperature by an average of 12 degrees Fahrenheit. He had calculated that the improved atomization increased fuel efficiency by approximately 7%. Most importantly, he had theoretical projections suggesting that power output might increase by 5 to 8% due to more complete combustion. Harrison made a decision that would change the course of Jimmy's story. He authorized a controlled test using one Sherman that was already scheduled for engine overhaul. If the engine failed, they would simply proceed with the planned maintenance. If it worked, they would document the results and send them up the chain of command. They selected a tank commanded by Sergeant Thomas Kowalski, a Chicago native who had worked in his father's automotive shop before the war. Kowalski understood engines intimately and could detect problems before they became critical. More importantly, he trusted Harrison's judgment and was willing to take the calculated risk. On the morning of August 20th, they drained the Sherman's fuel tank and refilled it with 90 gallons of Jimmy's modified mixture. The recipe was precise. For every 100 gallons of standard 80-octane military gasoline, Jimmy added 12 gallons of ethanol and 3 quarts of acetone. He had calculated these ratios after dozens of small-scale tests, seeking the balance between cooling, power, and safety. The engine started normally, the distinctive radial rumble echoing across the motor pool. Kowalski let it idle for 10 minutes, while Jimmy monitored temperature gauges with intense focus. The first indication came quickly. The engine was running 15 degrees cooler than normal operating temperature, even in the morning heat that already exceeded 90 degrees. Kowalski engaged the transmission and began running the tank through standard maneuvers. Within minutes, something remarkable became apparent. The Sherman was responding differently. Acceleration was crisper, more immediate. When Kowalski pushed the throttle for maximum speed on the makeshift test track they had cleared in the desert, the speedometer climbed past the usual 24 miles per hour maximum, reaching 27, then 28. Lieutenant Reynolds, watching from a jeep alongside the track, saw his engineering education collide with empirical reality. The Sherman, that reliable but unremarkable workhorse of American armor, was matching the reported road speed of German Panthers. More incredibly, the engine temperature remained stable, actually running cooler than standard Shermans at half that speed. They ran tests for 3 continuous hours. Kowalski pushed the tank through every operational scenario: rapid acceleration, sustained high-speed running, sharp turns that stressed the transmission, climbing steep inclines that would normally cause overheating. Throughout it all, Jimmy's mixture performed beyond even his optimistic projections. The fuel efficiency calculation proved accurate. They were getting approximately 7% more range from each tank of fuel, but the speed increase was the revelation that captured everyone's attention. The transformation in the motor pool's attitude happened almost immediately. The same mechanics who had mocked Jimmy's mason jars were now asking questions, wanting to understand the chemistry, requesting demonstrations. Moonshine Dawson became something closer to respect. Wizard Dawson, some started calling him, though Jimmy deflected any praise with characteristic Appalachian humility. But Sergeant O'Brien, the Boston mechanic who had started the mockery, remained skeptical. He argued that short-term tests meant nothing. Engines could perform well initially, and then fail catastrophically after extended use. The real question, he insisted, was durability. Would Jimmy's mixture damage engines over hundreds of miles of operation? Harrison authorized extended testing. For 2 weeks, Kowalski's Sherman ran exclusively on the modified fuel mixture, participating in training exercises, patrol duties, and convoy operations. Every evening, Jimmy and a team of mechanics performed detailed inspections, checking spark plugs, examining cylinder compression, analyzing oil samples for contamination or abnormal wear. The results defied O'Brien's predictions. Not only was there no accelerated wear, but several metrics actually improved. The spark plugs showed cleaner combustion deposits. The cylinder compression readings remained stable. Most remarkably, the oil analysis revealed lower contamination levels than comparable Shermans running standard fuel. Captain Richard Morrison, the company commander overseeing the motor pool, was a West Point graduate who understood both the military bureaucracy and the importance of battlefield innovation. He recognized that Jimmy's discovery could have significant strategic implications. If American armor could reliably match or exceed German tank speeds while improving fuel efficiency and reducing mechanical failures, it would alter tactical equations across every theater. Morrison documented everything meticulously, preparing a report that included temperature data, speed measurements, fuel efficiency calculations, and durability assessments. He sent it through channels to division headquarters, where it landed on the desk of Colonel James Patterson, the division's logistics officer. Patterson was a pragmatist who had spent 20 years in the Army managing supply chains and understanding how small improvements could cascade into major advantages. He read Morrison's report with increasing interest, then did something unusual. He drove out to the motor pool himself to interview Jimmy Dawson. The meeting was almost comical. Jimmy, still wearing grease-stained coveralls and speaking in his thick Kentucky accent, explained combustion chemistry to a bird colonel, using terms learned from moonshine production. He talked about cuts and heads and tails, distilling terminology that actually described precise chemical separations. He explained how his grandfather had taught him to understand fuel by smell, by color, by how it burned in a test flame. Patterson listened without interruption, his decades of military experience telling him he was witnessing something genuine. When Jimmy finished, the colonel asked one question: "Can you teach this to other mechanics? Can this be standardized and distributed?" Jimmy considered the question with the same careful deliberation he applied to fuel ratios. His mixture required precise measurements and quality control. The ethanol and acetone had to be pure, the ratios exact. But yes, he explained, any competent mechanic could learn to mix it if given proper training and equipment. Patterson made his decision. He authorized a pilot program for the entire 2nd Armored Division. Jimmy would train a team of mechanics in each battalion, teaching them his mixing procedures. They would modify fuel for all Sherman tanks, documenting results and refining procedures. If successful, Patterson would push for Army-wide adoption. The training program revealed Jimmy's unexpected gift for teaching. He could break down complex chemistry into simple, memorable procedures. He created mixing checklists, quality control tests, and troubleshooting guides. He taught mechanics to smell fuel and detect contamination, to check combustion characteristics with simple flame tests, to adjust ratios for different environmental conditions. By October, more than 80 Sherman tanks in the 2nd Armored Division were running on modified fuel. The results were consistent across all vehicles: improved speed, better cooling, enhanced reliability. Tank commanders reported that they could now execute tactical maneuvers previously impossible. Maintenance logs showed dramatic reductions in engine-related problems. Fuel consumption figures indicated the division was stretching their logistics further than planners had thought possible. The impact extended beyond pure performance metrics. Tank crews, knowing their vehicles could now match or exceed German armor in speed, experienced a psychological transformation. The Sherman had always been respected for its reliability and the excellent training American crews received, but speed had been an acknowledged weakness. That limitation was now gone, and the confidence shift was palpable. Lieutenant Reynolds, who had initially expressed concern about Jimmy's experiments, wrote in his journal about a conversation with Corporal Michael Chen, a driver from San Francisco. Chen described feeling like they had been given a secret weapon, something the enemy didn't know about. When German tanks retreated, expecting Shermans to be slower in pursuit, American armor could now maintain contact, changing the dynamics of engagement. The story might have ended there as a successful divisional innovation, but in November, something unexpected happened. During operations near the town of El Gueta, a German technical officer named Heinrich Weber was captured. Weber had been responsible for maintaining Panther tanks, and during interrogation, he mentioned something that caught the intelligence officer's attention. German tank crews had reported encounters with American armor that seemed faster than normal, moving with unexpected speed during tactical maneuvers. Weber and his fellow technicians had dismissed these reports as combat stress or misidentification. Panthers were supposed to be faster than Shermans. That was established fact. The idea that American tanks had somehow improved seemed impossible given what German intelligence knew about Allied production and standardization. When Weber learned that American mechanics had indeed modified their tanks using fuel additives, his reaction was telling. As a trained engineer, he understood immediately what had been accomplished. He explained that German fuel research focused on synthetic production from coal due to petroleum shortages, not on performance additives. The idea of using alcohol compounds to improve combustion characteristics in existing engines had been explored academically, but never implemented in the field. What impressed Weber most was the simplicity. German military technology often emphasized complexity and engineering sophistication. The idea that an Appalachian soldier with moonshine experience could solve a critical performance problem using readily available compounds contradicted assumptions about American technical capabilities. It represented a different approach to innovation, practical, empirical, focused on immediate battlefield needs rather than theoretical perfection. This perspective from the opposing side validated what Patterson and Morrison had already concluded. Jimmy's modification represented more than improved tank performance. It exemplified a particularly American approach to problem-solving, practical ingenuity, willingness to experiment, and the absence of rigid hierarchical barriers that might prevent a corporal's idea from reaching colonels. By December, Patterson's reports had reached the War Department in Washington. Chemical engineers at Army laboratories analyzed Jimmy's mixture, confirmed his results, and refined the formula for mass production. They added quality control specifications, safety protocols, and distribution procedures. The modified fuel received an official designation and entered the Army's technical manual system. The production challenge was substantial but manageable. The United States was already producing vast quantities of industrial alcohol and acetone for various purposes. Redirecting a fraction of that production to fuel modification required logistics coordination but no new industrial capacity. By early 1945, modified fuel began reaching armored units in Europe. The impact on Sherman performance was exactly as Jimmy's initial tests had predicted. Tanks in the 1st, 3rd, and 7th Armies reported the same speed increases, cooling improvements, and reliability enhancements. Maintenance logs showed reduced engine problems across thousands of vehicles. Fuel efficiency gains meant logistics convoys could carry other critical supplies. Perhaps more significantly, the psychological effect extended throughout the armored corps. Tank crews operating in the difficult final months of the European conflict had one less disadvantage to overcome. Their vehicles could move as fast as they needed, when they needed, without the constant concern about speed limitations or overheating. The story of how this modification spread through the Army reached even to tankers who had never met Jimmy Dawson. Corporal Robert Martinez, a Sherman driver from New Mexico serving with the Third Army, wrote to his brother in March 1945, describing the magic fuel that made his tank run better than it ever had. Martinez didn't know where it came from or who invented it, but he was grateful to whoever figured it out. Lieutenant Daniel O'Connor, commanding a Sherman in the First Army, noted in his diary that the modified fuel made a particular difference during rapid advances. When enemy forces retreated and speed became critical to maintaining pressure, American armor could now sustain pursuit without falling behind. The tactical implications were subtle but real. Enemy units had less time to establish new positions, less opportunity to organize effective withdrawals. But Jimmy Dawson himself remained largely unknown outside his division. He never sought recognition, uncomfortable with attention and content to simply solve problems. When Patterson recommended him for a commendation, Jimmy asked that it not be processed, arguing that he had just done his job. The colonel, understanding mountain dignity, respected the request, but ensured that Jimmy's contribution was documented in official records. Technical Sergeant Harrison, who had given Jimmy the chance to prove his concept, understood something important about the type of innovation that wins conflicts. It wasn't always the dramatic technological breakthrough or the sophisticated new weapon. Sometimes it was a corporal from Kentucky who understood combustion because his grandfather made moonshine, who was willing to experiment when others mocked, and who persisted until theory became proven performance. The transformation from ridicule to respect was complete, but for Jimmy, little had changed in his own self-perception. He remained the same quiet mechanic, now training others, still mixing fuel with the same careful precision he had learned in Appalachian hollers. When younger soldiers asked about his invention, he would deflect, saying he just applied what his grandfather taught him about how things burn. Sergeant O'Brien, who had started the mockery months earlier, became one of Jimmy's strongest advocates. He publicly acknowledged his initial skepticism had been wrong, and he worked hard to ensure proper mixing procedures were followed throughout the motor pool. The Boston mechanic, raised in a culture that valued formal education and institutional expertise, had learned that innovation could come from unexpected sources and unconventional backgrounds. As the conflict in Europe approached its conclusion in the spring of 1945, the modified fuel had become standard throughout American armored forces. Production reports indicated that approximately 8,000 Sherman tanks were operating with the enhanced mixture. Logistics analyses calculated that the fuel efficiency improvements had saved roughly 200,000 gallons of gasoline monthly, enough to fill more than 3 Liberty ship cargo tanks. The speed improvements, while seemingly modest at 3 to 4 miles per hour, had tactical significance beyond the raw numbers. Tank commanders could execute maneuvers with greater flexibility, respond to changing situations more quickly, and maintain operational tempo during critical moments. These advantages were difficult to quantify in statistical reports, but were understood intimately by every tanker who had experienced them. The cooling benefits proved particularly valuable during the summer months of 1945, when armored units operating in southern Germany faced temperatures that would have stressed standard Sherman engines. Maintenance records showed substantially lower rates of heat-related mechanical problems compared to previous summers, keeping more vehicles operational when they were needed most. By the time the conflict ended in May, Jimmy Dawson's modification had become so standard that many newer tankers didn't even know tanks had ever operated differently. The modified fuel was simply how Shermans ran, an accepted part of the technical specification that required no explanation. The post-conflict analysis conducted by Army ordnance experts concluded that the modification had contributed measurably to operational effectiveness. While no single factor determines outcomes in mechanized warfare, the cumulative effect of thousands of tanks operating with improved speed, reliability, and efficiency had tactical significance. The report recommended that similar approaches to field innovation be encouraged, that the Army establish better mechanisms for testing and adopting soldier-initiated improvements. Jimmy Dawson returned to Pike County, Kentucky, in November 1945, carrying his discharge papers and the same worn duffel bag he had packed 3 years earlier. He went back to work in his cousin's garage, maintaining civilian vehicles and never mentioning his role in modifying army tanks. When veterans gathered at the county seat to share stories, Jimmy listened quietly, offering no tales of his own. Years later, when a military historian researching Sherman tank modifications tracked Jimmy down, the Kentucky mechanic was in his 60s, still working on engines, still understanding combustion in ways that formal training rarely taught. He answered questions with the same careful precision he had used in mixing fuel, but he deflected any suggestion that his contribution had been special. He had just, he insisted, applied what his grandfather taught him and done what needed doing. The historian persisted, explaining that military records showed Jimmy's modification had been used by thousands of tanks, that it had improved performance measurably, that it represented an important example of field innovation. Jimmy listened, nodded, and offered a response that summarized his entire philosophy. Grandfather always said, if something ain't working right, you got to understand why before you can fix it. I just understood why that fuel wasn't burning the way it should, and I knew how to make it better. Wasn't nothing more complicated than that. The transformation from mocked hillbilly tinkerer to validated innovator had never mattered much to Jimmy Dawson. What mattered was solving problems, helping the soldiers who depended on those tanks, and honoring the practical wisdom his grandfather had passed down through generations of Appalachian self-reliance. The recognition, the official reports, the documented impact, these were external validations of something Jimmy had known from the beginning, that understanding how things actually work matters more than assumptions about how they should work. Technical Sergeant Harrison, who retired as a master sergeant and spent 30 years teaching automotive technology at a community college in Iowa, always included Jimmy's story in his lessons about innovation. He would tell students that the most important breakthroughs often come from people who understand fundamentals deeply, even if they lack formal credentials. The Moonshine mixer who made Sherman tanks faster, Harrison would explain, proved that practical wisdom and willingness to experiment can trump institutional skepticism. The broader lesson from Jimmy Dawson's modification extended beyond fuel chemistry and tank performance. It illustrated how modern warfare required not just industrial production and technological sophistication, but also the ability to identify and implement improvements at every level. The American military's relative openness to field innovation, its willingness to test ideas regardless of source, and its capacity to scale successful solutions across massive organizations. These factors contributed to effectiveness in ways that were difficult to measure but impossible to dismiss. German technical officer Heinrich Weber, who after the conflict became an automotive engineer in Bavaria, wrote in his memoirs about the moment he learned American tankers were using modified fuel. It represented, he observed, a fundamental difference in approach. German engineering emphasized precision design and controlled production. American practice encouraged experimentation and field modification. Neither approach was universally superior, but in the context of industrialized warfare, the ability to improve and adapt rapidly provided significant advantages. The Sherman tank itself became a symbol of this philosophy. It was never the most sophisticated armor, never the most heavily protected, never the fastest in its original configuration. But it was reliable, produced in extraordinary numbers, constantly improved through modification and adaptation, and operated by well-trained crews who could maximize its capabilities. Jimmy Dawson's fuel modification fit perfectly within this broader pattern, a practical solution that made a good tank better without requiring redesign or retooling production lines. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.